Judge Thomas Waters settled into his seat, adjusting the gavel on the polished wooden desk. His mind was already focused on the next case, a typical morning in his small but busy courtroom. He was a man of routine, accustomed to the rhythm of his work. He'd seen countless defendants walk through those heavy courtroom doors, each one filing through the motions of justice, hoping for fairness, but rarely expecting anything extraordinary. When Vanessa Hill entered the room, her presence was understated, yet undeniable. She was dressed simply, wearing a dark jacket over a blouse and slacks, her posture straight and confident. Judge Waters noted her composed demeanor, but beyond that, he barely gave her a second thought. He called her case, not yet realizing who she was. As Vanessa stood before him, her calm voice cut through the usual murmur of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I'm here to address a speeding ticket," she said with a quiet strength. "I was driving through the school zone, but I didn't see the sign in time." Her words were polite, not defensive, but the judge couldn't shake the feeling that something about her stood apart. Still, it didn't matter. To him, she was simply another person caught in the web of minor infractions that filled his court docket daily. "Is this your first violation?" Judge Waters asked, glancing at the file in front of him, already making assumptions about the case's simplicity. Vanessa nodded, maintaining a steady eye contact. "Yes, Your Honor. I've always made sure to follow the rules of the road. It was an honest mistake." Without much further inquiry, Judge Waters adjusted his glasses and began to deliver the standard procedures. "Given that this is your first offense, I'll issue a fine of $150. His tone was firm but routine. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Just another day of administering justice, or so he thought. Vanessa's face remained calm as she nodded in acknowledgement, accepting the fine without protest. The judge barely noticed, but she wasn't shaken. It was almost as if she had anticipated the outcome from the moment she entered the room. With a simple "Thank you, Your Honor," she turned and walked toward the exit. As Vanessa made her way out, Judge Waters scribbled a note to himself, preparing for the next case. The room felt like it was returning to its usual hum, and yet, a small part of him lingered on the brief interaction. He couldn't quite place it. There was something about her. But the moment passed quickly, and with it, any further reflection. What neither the judge nor anyone in that courtroom realized was that this was not just another minor infraction. It was a moment that would soon reshape their understanding of power, privilege, and perception. The gavel came down with a sharp tap, signaling the end of the session. The courtroom's energy shifted as the clerk shuffled the papers, preparing for the next case. Judge Waters glanced briefly at his docket, mentally preparing himself for the next routine case in front of him. But his eyes lingered for a moment on Vanessa, who was now walking toward the front of the room to settle the fine. Vanessa moved with the same quiet confidence she had displayed upon entering, her steps measured and calm. As she reached the desk to pay her fine, the court clerk, an older woman named Betty, looked up and froze. There was something about the way Vanessa carried herself that seemed familiar, but Betty couldn't quite place it. Vanessa smiled politely at her as she handed over the necessary documents. "Here you go," Vanessa said, her voice soft yet authoritative. Betty smiled back, still trying to figure out where she had seen that face before. Her fingers moved automatically, processing the payment and handing Vanessa a receipt, but her mind was elsewhere. The name on the case file seemed unusual too, Vanessa Hill. But it wasn't the name that was bothering Betty. It was the woman's face. As Vanessa turned to leave, Betty watched her walk away, the memory of her face now buzzing in the back of her mind. She pulled out her phone and quickly opened her social media app, scanning the feed absent-mindedly. And there it was, an image of Vanessa, front and center in a political article. The headline read, "Vanessa Hill appointed as Federal Secretary of Education." Betty's heart skipped a beat. She was sure of it now. The woman who had just left her office was none other than the new Secretary of Education. Vanessa Hill, a powerful figure in national politics, was standing in front of her just minutes ago, paying a speeding fine as if she were any other citizen. Betty's thoughts raced as she processed the moment. Could this really be the same person? The woman who had entered the courtroom with no fanfare, dressed simply, carrying herself with quiet grace. The realization left her stunned. How had Judge Waters, a seasoned professional, missed this? She wondered if anyone else in the courtroom had recognized her. At that very moment, the judge was preparing for the next case, unaware of the storm that was beginning to brew. Vanessa's identity had not yet dawned on him. He had treated her as just another defendant, like so many others who had passed through his courtroom. The thought of his decision never crossed his mind. Until now. Betty couldn't help but wonder what it would mean for the judge when he discovered that the woman he had just found was one of the most important figures in the country. Would he feel regret, or would he brush it off as just another ordinary day? Unknowingly, Judge Waters had made a decision that would come to define his career. Betty's hands shook slightly as she stared at her phone screen, still trying to process what she had just learned. The article about Vanessa Hill was clear enough, showing her face beside bold headlines celebrating her appointment as the Secretary of Education. Betty glanced down at the receipt she had just handed to Vanessa. The name matched. There was no mistake. Her mind raced, piecing the details together. How had Judge Waters not recognized her? The news about Vanessa's appointment had been everywhere recently, and she was known for her strong, transformative views on education. The woman who had just quietly accepted a speeding fine was not only influential in shaping national policy, but was also under intense scrutiny from the media. Betty couldn't fathom how the judge, in the middle of his official duties, hadn't noticed the gravity of the situation. Her thoughts were interrupted when another clerk walked into the room, snapping her fingers to grab Betty's attention. "Betty, are you all right? You look pale. You haven't heard. The woman who just left, she's Vanessa Hill, the new Secretary of Education. Can you believe it? That was her." Betty could only nod, still stunned. She quickly called up the court's chief assistant, Jim, and told him what had just happened. They both knew the ramifications of what was unfolding. "This isn't just any fine," Jim said in disbelief, his voice low. "That was a national figure who's been making waves in the political world. I can't believe it. How did we miss that?" Meanwhile, Judge Waters was completely unaware of the storm that was brewing outside his chambers. As he moved from one case to the next, he didn't give much thought to Vanessa Hill beyond the fact that she had been just another person passing through his courtroom that day. He hadn't even paused to consider the circumstances of her demeanor, how composed she had been, how effortlessly she had accepted the fine. It was all too routine for him. But now, as the room buzzed with realization, the clerk's words began to settle in the back of his mind. Vanessa Hill, Secretary of Education. A sudden unease crept into the judge's thoughts. Had he missed something important? It wasn't like him to overlook details, and yet he had failed to recognize someone of such significance. The thought lingered, but only for a moment. He continued on with his work, focused on the next case that awaited him. But the nagging feeling didn't go away. Back in the staff room, Betty and Jim exchanged uneasy glances. They were well aware of the potential consequences of this oversight. The world beyond their small courtroom would soon take notice of what had transpired. And with it, a public conversation about authority, recognition, and respect was just beginning to take shape. The morning passed quietly for Judge Thomas Waters. He moved through his usual cases, traffic violations, minor disputes, and a few small claims, without much thought. He'd been a judge for over 20 years and had seen it all. But as the day wore on, something began to gnaw at him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was the nagging feeling that something about the previous case, the one with Vanessa Hill, hadn't sat right. He replayed the events in his mind, her calm composure, the way she handled herself with ease, almost as though she were used to facing difficult situations. He had expected some pushback, or at least a defensive argument, but there had been none. She had simply accepted the fine without question. In retrospect, it seemed too easy. A few hours later, Judge Waters was sitting in his office, reviewing his docket for the next session, when his eyes caught a headline in the local news. It was a story about Vanessa Hill's recent appointment as the Federal Secretary of Education. His heart stopped for a beat. He squinted at the picture of Vanessa, recognizing her instantly. His breath caught in his throat as the full weight of the realization hit him. The woman he had found earlier that day was the same Vanessa Hill who had been making headlines all over the country. The news story described her as a groundbreaking figure in education reform, a strong, ambitious leader who had taken the helm of the U.S. Department of Education with bold plans for systemic change. She was a woman of considerable power and influence, known for her advocacy on behalf of underserved communities and her tireless work in the fight for equal educational opportunities. Judge Waters felt a rush of embarrassment wash over him. How had he not known? How could he have treated her like just another defendant, no different than any of the others who appeared before him every day? His mind spun as he considered the implications. Had he acted too hastily, too dismissively? Was there an unspoken bias at play, even if it was unconscious? The possibility weighed heavily on him. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He was a man who prided himself on fairness and integrity, but this oversight felt like a failure. He had made an automatic assumption based on her appearance, her demeanor, and perhaps her race, and now he was left with the sinking realization that in doing so, he had missed the opportunity to treat Vanessa Hill with the recognition and respect she truly deserved. But it was too late. The mistake had been made. The world outside his courtroom was watching, and soon everyone would know. Within hours of Vanessa Hill's departure from the courthouse, the story began to spread like wildfire. The small courtroom in the sleepy town had suddenly become the center of a growing media frenzy. Word had leaked. Vanessa Hill, the woman who had been handed a speeding ticket and fined by Judge Thomas Waters, was none other than the newly appointed Federal Secretary of Education. It didn't take long for news outlets to pick up the story. At first, it seemed like just a quirky anecdote, a momentary oddity where a powerful woman received a routine fine. But as the day wore on, the story grew. Social media platforms were abuzz with reactions. Some expressed disbelief that such a high-ranking official could be caught in such a mundane situation, while others zeroed in on the judge's apparent lack of recognition. As the story gathered steam, questions began to emerge. How could a seasoned judge have missed such a high-profile figure? Was it an honest mistake, or was there something more at play? People began debating whether the judge had acted out of ignorance or whether something deeper, unconscious bias, had influenced his actions. In the political world, the news spread quickly as well. Opponents of the current administration seized on the story, turning it into a larger point about respect and recognition for people of power, especially those who had fought hard to break barriers. Political commentators, eager for any piece of drama in an otherwise slow news cycle, jumped into the conversation. They speculated on whether Judge Waters had treated Vanessa differently because of her race, her gender, or the fact that he simply hadn't recognized her. While the media buzzed, the public reaction was split. Many saw the incident as a sign of how easily those in power could be overlooked or dismissed in ordinary situations. Others defended Judge Waters, claiming it was nothing more than a misunderstanding, a small mistake that anyone could have made. But underlying the conversation was a tension about the way individuals, particularly those in positions of influence, were treated by the system. In the courtroom, Betty, the clerk, couldn't shake her worry. She had seen the incident unfold firsthand, and now she was watching as it became a national conversation. She couldn't help but wonder how Judge Waters felt. His composed exterior had seemed unaffected when Vanessa had left the courtroom, but she knew the pressure was building. By the time the news outlets began calling for interviews, the narrative had already shifted. What had started as a small courtroom mistake was now a nationwide conversation about authority, bias, and respect. And, in a way, it had become an unwelcome spotlight on a judge who had simply done his job. Until now. The question wasn't just about Vanessa's fine anymore. It was about what the incident revealed about the justice system and about the people within it. As the media frenzy surrounding her speeding ticket spiraled, Vanessa Hill found herself at the center of a story that she never could have anticipated. The press had turned a routine court appearance into a spectacle, questioning the fairness of the encounter and the treatment she had received. She knew the attention would only grow, but instead of retreating, she decided to address the situation head-on. Vanessa called a press conference the following day. The room was filled with journalists, cameras flashing as she entered. She was as composed as ever, exuding the same quiet confidence she had shown in the courtroom. The weight of the moment was clear, but her focus remained sharp. She walked up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and began speaking, her voice calm but firm. "I want to start by addressing the incident that took place in court yesterday," she said, her eyes meeting the camera. "Yes, I received a speeding fine. Like any other citizen, I am subject to the law. There's no special treatment, nor should there be." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "But this incident isn't just about a ticket. It's about the underlying issues of fairness, recognition, and respect. Things we must all consider in every part of our society." Vanessa spoke about how quickly the world had been ready to judge her based on a moment, a simple mistake. She acknowledged that, while her position had put her in the public eye, the conversation surrounding her fine was less about her than it was about larger societal issues. "I think we all need to ask ourselves," she continued, "how do we treat people based on their appearance, their background, or their position? Do we see them for who they truly are, or do we make assumptions based on who we think they should be?" She let the question linger. It's an important conversation to have, and one we cannot afford to ignore. The press conference was a powerful moment. Rather than being defensive, Vanessa used the spotlight to highlight broader issues of systemic inequities, both in the legal system and in society. She spoke not only as the Secretary of Education, but also as a woman who understood the impact of unconscious bias and the need for change. Her ability to turn what could have been a public relations disaster into a moment of reflection impressed many. Her words resonated with people across the country, sparking a wave of support from advocacy groups, educators, and citizens who appreciated her thoughtful approach. While some still criticized the incident as an example of a bureaucratic error, many found her handling of the situation both graceful and empowering. Vanessa Hill, once seen as just another politician, had now become a figure symbolizing fairness, dignity, and the importance of recognizing the humanity in every interaction, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. In the wake of Vanessa Hill's press conference, the fallout from her courtroom encounter intensified. The story continued to dominate headlines, and the pressure was mounting on Judge Thomas Waters. He had been a respected figure in the community for years, but now his actions were under scrutiny. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about whether he had failed to treat a high-ranking government official with the respect she deserved. The judge had spent the evening reading the news, listening to the commentary, and reflecting on his behavior. At first, he had dismissed the media frenzy as an overreaction. After all, he had only issued a fine in accordance with the law. But as the hours passed, doubt began to creep in. He thought about the case again and again. Vanessa Hill had been composed, professional, and completely respectful. He had treated her the same way he would any other defendant. But now, that felt like a mistake. Judge Waters sat at his desk early the next morning, drafting a statement. His hand shook slightly as he typed, the weight of the situation weighing heavily on his conscience. He knew he needed to apologize, not just because of the fine, but because of how he had treated someone who, in hindsight, deserved far more recognition. Finally, he finished his statement and released it to the press. The apology was sincere, acknowledging the oversight and the assumptions that had led to it. "I want to begin by offering my deepest apologies to Ms. Vanessa Hill," the statement read. "I acted in a manner that, upon reflection, was not fitting of the respect and dignity that every individual deserves, particularly someone who holds such an important position in our government. I failed to recognize her as I should have, and for that, I am truly sorry." Judge Waters continued, expressing that while his actions were unintentional, he understood the deeper implications of how they could be perceived. "As a judge, I hold myself to the highest standards of fairness and impartiality. I understand now that my failure to recognize Ms. Hill was not just a mistake. It was an opportunity missed to treat her with the respect she deserves. I will work to ensure that I do better moving forward." The apology was met with mixed reactions. Many respected the judge for owning his mistake, acknowledging it publicly, and taking responsibility. Others, however, felt that the apology was insufficient, coming too late after the media storm had already unfolded. They wondered whether it was a genuine reflection of remorse or simply a response to the pressure from the public eye. But the apology did achieve one important thing. It opened a space for reflection, both for Judge Waters and for the wider community. The conversation about unconscious bias, privilege, and fairness had become unavoidable, and people across the nation were now considering how they treated others, especially those in positions of power. Judge Waters, for his part, knew this moment would stay with him for a long time. He had learned a hard lesson, one that would shape his approach to justice in the future. Months passed since the incident in Judge Thomas Waters' courtroom, but the ripple effects were still felt. The media frenzy had subsided, but the conversation about fairness, bias, and respect lingered in the public consciousness. For many, the story had become more than just a curious anecdote about a speeding fine. It had become a lens through which they examined their own actions and assumptions. Judge Waters, now under a closer watch, had spent the time since his apology working to address the issues raised by the incident. He began attending workshops on unconscious bias and diversity training, determined to better understand the subtle ways in which his own assumptions might influence his decisions. He had always prided himself on being impartial, but the incident had forced him to confront the possibility that, like everyone else, he was not immune to bias. The local community had mixed reactions to his efforts. Some respected his willingness to learn and grow from the situation, while others still couldn't shake the feeling that the judge's actions had been reflective of deeper societal issues. Yet, Judge Waters remained steadfast in his commitment to becoming a better judge, a more aware, thoughtful, and empathetic one. He had even volunteered to speak at local schools and community organizations about bias, hoping to turn his mistake into a teachable moment. Vanessa Hill, meanwhile, had used the incident to further her mission in her role as Secretary of Education. While the media frenzy had initially been a distraction, she had leveraged it as an opportunity to speak on systemic inequalities, not just in the legal system, but in education as well. Her response to the incident had earned her widespread praise for her grace and her ability to turn the spotlight into a powerful statement about equity and respect. She spoke at conferences, engaging in dialogues about implicit bias, privilege, and the importance of diversity in all sectors, including education. The moment in the courtroom had reinforced her belief that progress could only be made if people were willing to have hard conversations about the ways in which bias influenced their actions and decisions. Over time, Vanessa's ability to rise above the controversy became a symbol of resilience. She had not let the public spectacle define her, and instead had used it as a platform to make lasting change. In the months that followed, her department pushed forward several new initiatives aimed at addressing inequalities in schools, from improved access to resources for underserved communities to more inclusive curriculums that reflected diverse perspectives. For both Vanessa and Judge Waters, the incident became a pivotal moment in their careers. It forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the systems they were a part of. In the end, what started as a minor court case had ignited a national conversation that had profound implications for the way people viewed power, fairness, and the recognition of one another's worth.